Testament today from Acts, chapter 2, verses 1 through 21. When the feast of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Without warning, there was a sound like a strong wind, gale force. No one could tell where it came from. It filled the whole building. Then, like a wildfire, the Holy Spirit spread through their ranks, and they started speaking in a number of different languages as the Spirit prompted them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, the crowd came together in bewilderment, because each one heard them speaking in his own language. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Are not all these men who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judah, Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues." Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, "What does this mean?" Some, however, made fun of them and said, "They have had too much wine." Then Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice and addressed the crowd, "Fellow Jews and all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. These men are not drunk, as you suppose. It's only 9 in the morning. No, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. In the last days, God says, "I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my Spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. I will show wonders in the heaven above and signs on earth below, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved."
There's a lot of interest in spirituality these days, and there are millions spent on spiritually oriented music and video, millions more on books and other paraphernalia. Here in Southern California, the quest for spiritual experience is quite out in the open. The center of every city has, in addition to several churches and temples of various kinds, a handful of storefronts that can pay the rent by telling people their fortunes or reading palms or interpreting crystals and the like. We live in a time much like that of ancient Rome, where you could come into a city and have your choice of gods or goddesses at the various Roman temples along the main street. What are people searching for? People want it, a spiritual experience. They want some insight at life beyond the 5 senses, some way of understanding the future, perhaps a little bit of a grasp on life after death. That they will do the craziest things in order to find it, including bringing their palm tree into a palm reader to have it read. It's a good thing that people are seeking. It's a good thing that much of the ultra-rationalistic cynicism of the mid-20th century has faded. But as people in the 21st century venture out into the vast forests of spiritual solutions, what are they finding behind this tree? What are they uncovering under that rock? And what about the question of multiple truth? Is it helpful to say about our spiritual quest, as so many do, well, if this works for me and if that works for you, well and good? Is that a helpful approach? For us in the Jewish Christian tradition, this kind of thinking that somehow every path is a good path, it seems wrong because we know about the reality of sin. You and I know that there are many thoughts and actions and feelings which do not come from God, which do not emanate from truth and light, but which instead belong to sin and error and darkness, many paths which lead in the wrong direction. And so it's important in our quest that we end up finding the true Spirit and not a false one. A path that leads to the top of the hill rather than a path that leads off the edge of a cliff. It's important that we ultimately find the spiritual guidance which leads us to light and not to darkness. For Christians, this question of spirituality inevitably leads us to talk about God, the Holy Spirit, the sometimes forgotten third person of the Trinity. The great Presbyterian preacher Lloyd John Ogilvie once took a survey of his church members, and he asked them to name some big questions they had, some things they wanted him to address from the pulpit. And he reports that the most frequently asked questions were regarding spiritual experience. People were asking, how can I know more of God's power? How can I know the reality of God more fully in my life? I'm frustrated. I try to live as a Christian, but I keep running into brick walls. I want to know how to have a more positive daily experience as a Christian instead of always hitting those walls. Dr. Ogilvie determined that what his people were waiting for was the same thing that the early disciples were waiting for. An experience of the gift of the presence and the power of God. The power of God, who is God the Holy Spirit. So as we look to Pentecost, let's be focusing on this question. Who is that third person of the Trinity? Who is the Holy Spirit? Remember back in Acts chapter 1, those of you who were here last week, we talked about it. Jesus had told his friends, after being with them for 40 days, he had told his friends to wait for the power which was coming. After Easter, Jesus spent that amount of time, 40 days and 40 nights with his friends, and by his presence and teaching, Jesus had transformed them from a motley, discouraged lot to a strong band, ready to take on the world. But they lacked one thing, the power to do it, the presence of God to do it. And so they waited as Jesus told them. Jesus had transformed them by being with them. He had eaten with them. He had laughed with them. He taught them about the kingdom. He gave them a mission. He gave them a purpose. Then as he was about to leave, he said, be patient. Just wait, and something's going to happen which will surprise you, which will equip you, which will give you the ability to do what I'm asking you to do. And so now as we open Acts chapter 2, 10 days after Jesus had left them, his friends are still together. They're still believing. They're still waiting. They're waiting for power, the power of the presence of God. And so it's 7 weeks after Easter, 7 weeks of 7 days after that Passover weekend when Jesus was killed and was raised. And as the book of Leviticus tells us, 50 days, 7 weeks and a day after the Passover Sabbath, Jews were to have a special feast day. The feast was commanded by God so that the people could come and give thanks for God's great gifts of springtime, in particular the early rains and harvest. Here in this blessed coastal valley, this coastal plain, in which automatic irrigation is constant, in which the soil is so rich, producing strawberries year-round, it's tough to appreciate the difficulty and ultimate dependence on God that's required when rains from above falling on rocky, sandy soil, like you'd find in Judea, is the only source of food.